Speak about an apology for poetry, that is a work of literary criticism by Elizabethan poet Philip Sidney. It was written in approximately 1579 and first published in 1595 after his death. In his essay, Sidney integrates a number of classical and Italian precepts on fiction. The essence of his defense is that poetry, by combining the liveliness of history with the ethical focus of philosophy, is more effective than either history or philosophy in rousing its readers to virtue. The work also offers important comments on Edmund Spenser and the Elizabethan stage. Men drawn to music, astronomy, philosophy, and so forth all direct themselves to the highest end of the mystic knowledge by the Greeks called architectonic, which stands, as I think, in the knowledge of a man's self in the ethic and politic consideration, with the end of well-doing and not of well-knowing only. Sidney's program of literary reform concerns the connection between art and virtue. One of the themes of the apology is the insufficiency of simple presenting virtue as a precept. The poet must move man to virtuous action. Poetry can lead to virtuous action, and action relates to experience. From Sidney, the utilitarian view of rhetoric can be traced to Coleridge's criticism and, for instance, to the reaction to the Enlightenment. Coleridge's brief treatise on poesy or art sets forth a theory of imitation which bears a remarkable resemblance to that of Sidney. The contemporary impact of Sidney's apology is largely derivative of the humanistic precepts that inform the work and its linkage of the rhetorical with the civic virtue of prudence. Prudence offers a middle ground between two extremes. Prudence as a virtue places a greater value on practice than gnosis. Action is thus more important than abstract knowledge. It deals with the question of how to combine stability with innovation. Sidney's influence on future critics and poets relates more closely to his view of the place of poets in society. Sidney describes poetry as creating a separate reality. The romantic notion, as Sidney's Wordsworth, is that poetry privileges perception, imagination, and modes of understanding. Wordsworth seeks to go back to nature for moments, recollected in tranquility. Sidney, like Shelley and Wordsworth, sees the poet as being separate from society. To Sidney, the poet is not tied to any subjection. He saw art as equivalent to skill, a profession to be learned and developed, and nature as the objective empirical world. The poet can be invented, and thus it in fact grows another nature. Sidney writes that there is no art delivered to mankind that hath not the works of nature for his principal object. The poet that does not depart from external nature. His works are imitation or fiction, made of the materials of nature, and are shaped by the artist's vision. This vision is one that demands the reader's awareness of the art of imitation created through the marker, the poet. Sidney's notion of foreconceit means that a conception of the work must exist in the poet's mind before it is written. Free from the limitations of nature and independent from nature, poetry is capable of making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite a new form such as never were in nature. Sidney's doctrine presents the poet as creator, the poet's mediating role between two worlds, transcendent forms and historical actuality, corresponds to the Neoplatonic doctrine of emanation. A complement to this doctrine is the concept of return or catharsis, which finds a parallel in Sidney's contemplation of virtue based on man's rational desire. The apology contains only elements of Neoplatonism without adhering to the full doctrine. Thirdly, Sidney implies a theory of metaphoric language in his work. The recurring motif in apology is painting or portraiture. Apology applies language used in a way suggestive of what is known in modern literary theory as semiotics. His central premise, as was that of Socrates in Plato's The Republic, is that poetry is an art of imitation, that is, of representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, not unlike a speaking picture. Sidney pays his homepage to Aristotle as well, yet he develops his own idea of metaphoric language, one that is based on an analogy through universal correspondences. Sidney's humanistic poetics and his tendency to harmonize disparate extremes to seek mediation find expression in poetic works by John Donne. An apology for poetry is one of the most important contributions to literary theory written in English during the Renaissance. Sidney advocates a place for poetry within the framework of an aristocratic state while showing concern for both literary and national identity. Sidney responds in apology to an emerging antipathy to poetry as expressed in Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse. Gosson offers that is, in essence, an attack on imaginative literature. What is at stake in Sidney's argument is the defense of poetry's nobility. The significance of the nobility of poetry is its power to move readers to virtuous action. True poets must teach and delight, a view that dates back to Horace. In an era of antipathy for poetry and puritanical belief in the corruption engendered by literature, Sidney's defense was a significant contribution to the genre of literary criticism. It was England's first philosophical defense in which he describes poetry's ancient and indispensable place in society, its mimetic nature, and its ethical function. Among Sidney's gifts to his contemporaries were his respect for tradition and willingness to experiment. An example of the latter is his approach to Plato. Here he configures Plato's argument against poets by saying poets are the least liar. Poets never claim to know the truth, nor make circles around your imagination, nor rely on authority. As an expression of a cultural attitude descended from Aristotle, Sidney, when starting that the poet never affirmeth, makes the claim that all statements in literature are hypothetical or pseudo-statements. Sidney, as a traditionalist, however, gives attention to drama in contradistinction to poetry. Drama, writes Sidney, is observing neither the rules of honest civility nor of skillful poetry, and thus cannot do justice to the genre. In Sidney's day, anti-theatricality, an aesthetic and ideological concern, flourished among Sidney's circle at court. Theatre became a continuous issue in part because of the culmination of a growing contempt for the values of the emerging consumer culture. An expanding money economy encouraged social mobility. Europe at this time had its first encounter with inflation. London's theatres at that time grew in popularity so much by 1605, despite the introduction of charts, London commercial theatre could accommodate up to 8,000 men and women. Sidney had his own views on drama. In Apology, he shows opposition to the current of this day that pays little attention to unity of place in drama, but more specifically his concern is with the manner that the matter is conveyed. He explains that tragedy is not bound to history or the narrative, but to loves of poesy, having liberty either to feign a quite new matter or to frame the history of the most tragical conveniency. Sidney employs a number of strategies to assert the proper place of poetry. For instance, he argues against the way in which poetry was misaligned with youth, the effeminate with the timorous. He does so by introducing the idea that poetry is the companion of camps and by invoking the heroes of ages past. Sidney's reverence for the poet as soldier is significant because he himself was a soldier at one time. Poetry in Apology becomes an art that requires the noble student of courage. Sidney writes an apology for poetry in the form of a judicial operation for the defense, and thus it is like a trial in structure. Crucial to this defense is the descriptive discourse and the idea that poetry creates a separate reality. Sidney employs forensic rhetoric as a tool to make an argument that poetry not only conveys a separate reality, but that it has a long and venerable history, and it does not lie. It is defensible in its own right as a means to move readers to virtuous action. Stephen Gosson makes charts on poetry with Sidney answers. The charts are: first, poetry is the waste of time; second, poetry is the mother of lies; third, it is an art of abuse; and fourth, it's the Plato has rightly banished the poets from the ideal world. So, against these charts, Sidney has answered them in the following ways. First of all, poetry is the source of knowledge and it's a civilizing force for Sidney. Gosson attacks on poetry, saying that it corrupts the people and is the waste of time, but Sidney says that no learning is so good as that which teaches and moves to virtue, and that nothing can both teach and amuse so much as poetry does. In the same societies, poetry was the main source of education. He remembers ancient Greek society that respected poets. The poets are always to be looked up, so poetry is not a waste of time. To the second charge, Sidney answers that poet does not lie because he never affirms that his fiction is true and can never lie. The poetic truths are ideal and universal, therefore poetry cannot be a mother of lies. Sidney rejects that poetry is the source of abuses. To him, it is people who abuse poetry, not the vice versa. Abuses are more nuanced by philosophy and history than by poetry, by describing battles, bloodshed, violence, etc. On the contrary, poetry helps to maintain morality and peace by avoiding such violence and bloodsheds. Moreover, it brings light to knowledge. Sidney views that Plato, in his Republic, wanted to banish the abuse of poetry, not the poets. He himself was not free from poeticality, which we can find in his dialogues. Plato never says that all poets should be banished. He called for banishing only those poets who are inferior and unable to instruct the children. For Sidney, art is the imitation of nature, but is not slavish imitation as Plato views. Rather, it is a creative imitation. Nature is dull, incomplete, and ugly. It is artists who turn dull nature into golden color. He employs his creative faculty, imagination, and style of presentation to decorate the raw materials of nature. For Sidney, art is a speaking picture having spatial-temporal dimension. For Aristotle, human action is more important, but for Sidney, nature is important. Artists are to create art considering the level of readers. The only purpose of art is to teach and delight, like the whole tendency of Renaissance. Sidney favors poetic justice that is possible in poets' world, where good are rewarded and wicked people are punished. Plato's philosophy on virtue is worthless at the battlefield, but poet teaches man how to behave under all circumstances. Moral philosophy teaches virtues through abstract example, and history teaches virtues through concrete examples, but both are defective. Poetry teaches virtue by example as well as by percept. The poet creates his own world where he gives only the inspiring things, and thus poetry holds a superior position to that of philosophy and history. In the poet's golden world, heroes are ideally presented and evils are corrupt. The eidetic effort of a poem depends up on the poet's power to move. It depends up on the effective quality of poetry. Among the different forms of poetry like lyric, elegy, satire, comedy, etc., the epic is the best form, as it portrays heroic deeds and inspires heroic deeds, and inspires people to become courageous and patriotic. In this way, Sidney defines all the charges against poetry and stands for the sake of universal and timeless quality of poetry, making us know why the poets are universal genius. That's all for now. Thank you very much. Subscribe and see you in the next video.